The US Secretary of State is on his 6th visit to the Middle East since Israel started its war on Gaza. So what has Antony Blinken got to offer this time? And can Washington pressure Israel's government to change direction? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Nick Clark. The US Secretary of State has embarked on another diplomatic tour of the Middle East, with stops in Saudi Arabia, Egypt and Tel Aviv. It's all part of a push for a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas. Washington is under increasing pressure as warnings grow over catastrophic famine in Gaza and a ground invasion in Rafah. And the talks are happening as the US adopts its strongest language towards Israel, yet submitting a draft resolution to the UN that recognises the need for an immediate ceasefire tied to the release of captives held by Hamas. So what makes this visit any different from the previous 5? We'll explore these issues with our panel of guests in a moment, but first, this report by Alexandra Bias.
It's becoming a familiar sight. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken touching down in Israel on a diplomatic push for a ceasefire in Gaza. This attempt is his 6th, but he says he remains optimistic, and Hamas and Israel are closer to reaching an agreement.
There's still real challenges. We've closed the gaps, but there are still gaps. So I can't put a timeline on it.
Blinken has met Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and members of the Israeli War Cabinet. It's happening as Washington marks a clear shift in tone towards its ally. It submitted a UN resolution this week acknowledging the need for an immediate and sustained ceasefire, in its strongest language yet, after months of avoiding the term and vetoing similar resolutions. Blinken is bringing information from talks he's just had with a Saudi crown prince in Jeddah and Arab foreign ministers in Cairo. They discuss possible plans for Gaza after the war, including on how it could be governed and kept secure.
There's a clear consensus around a number of shared priorities. First, the need for an immediate, sustained ceasefire with the release of hostages. That would create space to surge more humanitarian assistance to relieve the suffering of many people and to build something more enduring.
There's also an agreement on the importance of avoiding any military escalation in the area of Rafah and the complete rejection of the displacement of Palestinians from outside of their land.
Netanyahu has so far brushed off any opposition to a planned ground invasion of Rafah. And as the diplomats talk, Israeli bombs are continuing to reduce Gaza to rubble. A new wave of attacks on Friday killed and injured dozens of Palestinians across the Strip. And the death toll from Israel's war is nearing 32,000 Palestinian men, women, and children. Alexandra Bias, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So a very important discussion for our panel today. We have in Washington, D.C., Ambassador Marcel Rafah, who's President Emeritus of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and a former State Department official. In Beijing today, but usually based in the UK, we have Professor Roxanne Farman-Fahmian, who is a specialist in modern Middle East politics, and in Ramallah, Nora Day is a Palestinian political analyst and a former senior correspondent here at Al Jazeera English. Welcome to the show, everybody. OK, Ambassador, I'd like to start with you, first of all. A lot of things happening in tandem right now. We have the UN Secretary of State, as I've been discussing, and Arab leaders talking about the future of Palestinian state. We have ceasefire resolutions before the UN Security Council, and then, of course, the negotiations for a ceasefire right here in Doha. Meanwhile, the shelling, the killing goes on. How do you assess where we are at now, and are we any closer to the guns over Gaza being silenced?
Well, as you mentioned in the piece, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to our discussion this morning. As mentioned in the piece that we just saw, this is the 6th trip for Secretary Blinken to the region. And obviously, it's been a very difficult challenge for him because you have a Secretary of State that's going out to the region on the one hand, with a clear mission and objective to bring Arab support to a plan post-Gaza, and then at the same time also talk to the Israelis about avoiding a major military action in Rafah, where you have such density of civilians all clustered in Rafah as they've moved from the north into the south. So it's been a difficult challenge because he doesn't have all the necessary tools. The president has not given the secretary, let's say, the leverage that he could use to, especially on the Israeli side. I think in terms of his discussions with the Arab leaders for the post-war in Gaza, there's probably been a lot more progress on that front, with the hope that in a post-Gaza and also in a post-Netanyahu environment, the plan that the Arabs are now discussing with the United States would appeal to the Israeli body politic enough to at least start the first very, very early steps. On the ceasefire, I think, obviously the main talks are happening with the intelligence sector. We have CIA Director Bill Burns and Mossad's intelligence chief and also the Egyptian intelligence chief meeting with the Qataris today. And I think that's where you're really going to see, hopefully, some action on a ceasefire. And the Americans have made a huge shift here.
We'll get into that in a second. I just want to jump in there for a second, sure. Ambassador. I want to bring in Noor from Ramallah. As you observe this, Noor, from where you are, the continued killing in Gaza, the diplomacy, the negotiations, the talk of the day after, how do you assess where we're at as a long-time expert in what's going on and as a Palestinian?
Thank you, Nick, for having me. I think as a Palestinian, this is a painful, cycle on repeat of American failed policy in the region. The Biden administration is talking to everybody under the sun except the Palestinians. And when it does talk to the Palestinians, it talks at them. It tells them what needs to be done, and it does not take into account what they want done and what the Palestinian public wants done. And it's a bit, I don't know what the right word would say, but a bit schizophrenic, a bit divorced from reality to be talking about the day after the war, when the onslaught is happening, when Al-Shifa Hospital is again under siege for the 5th day in a row now, when hundreds of people are being killed and injured every day. And when the prospect even of the day after for Gaza is about promises and nothing concrete. There's a verbal shift in the American narrative, but there isn't really a policy shift. There's a bit of an opportunistic, if you will, change in narrative because of domestic American considerations, but there isn't anything real or concrete in that change. And as the ambassador was saying, Biden hasn't given Blinken much leverage to use to push the Israelis, who have been intransigent, who have been uncooperative, who have continued to starve Palestinians as a matter of policy, to declare they're not willing to play ball. They don't want to talk about a political horizon. They don't even want to talk about the day after the war because there is no interest in ending this war. So it's not really clear to me what Blinken will bring to the table, except a lot of photo ops and the hope that his sweet talk this time will play out well for the audience and for the constituents of the Democratic Party back home.
Right. And Roxanne, there in Beijing, everything now rests, as everybody said, on the talks that are going on just a few kilometers from where I sit here in Doha, those ceasefire negotiations. But as we've just heard from Noor and from the ambassador, isn't the reality that a ceasefire is the last thing that Benjamin Netanyahu wants? It could split his coalition, it could split his power base, and he would then have some serious legal music to face. He ain't going to buy it, as they say.
Well, he's made clear he's not going to buy it. And I find that as a result, one has to look at Blinken's tour rather as a play for the American public. It's quite a diversionary tactic, I think. There's really only one thing that so far he has offered that has any concrete hope to it, and that is he has gone to the Saudis. He's spoken to Foreign Minister Faisal Farhan, and I think they are trying to make a swap, if you will, of the Saudis accepting normalization in return for them really pushing for a Palestinian or a two-state solution. The difficulty, I think, is that because the Israelis have no interest in that step, and as far as I understand from speaking to the people that I have, they have actually no plans in place. There's no one in the ministry actually working on this. There's no office in the Israeli government that is actually looking at strategies for two-state solutions. It is not really anything more real than what Blinken is talking about on these trips. So I think that it is a disappointing venture that he seems to be on, certainly for him, but also for the clout that the United States might be considered to be able to bring if, for example, they were willing to reduce the amount of arms sales to Israel. After all, 68% of the arms that the Israelis are using are American. And that, to me, seems to be a much stronger way to approach this. And it's one of the things that those in the Middle East, looking at other states that are not part of this conversation, but that play a role, Iran and a number of the axis of resistance that it controls. The question isn't there really a two-step game going on here, and the Americans are really not playing fair?
Right, Ambassador. So, is it your view then that this ceasefire deal, these negotiations that are going on here in Doha, will fail? That they will not agree a hostage, a captive deal, and that the ceasefire will not go ahead?
Well, it's hard to tell what will happen in these. I mean, you've got really a collection of very senior folks sitting at the table in Doha today. So we may see a breakthrough, but it's not a sure thing. And the only reason I agree with my colleague, the only reason that Netanyahu may accept a temporary, and he will call it that regardless of what everyone else calls it, that it'll be a pause, is only so he can get some of the Israeli hostages out. That would help him domestically. There is a lot of pressure on Netanyahu and Israel for the hostages. But it's not in his interest to have a long ceasefire, and that's why it would have to be a very short one. But the main problem here is that you have the American government really in a very tight balancing act. You know, here on one hand, you're trying to push the Israelis to allow more humanitarian aid and a ceasefire that releases some of the hostages and also gives you some breathing space and maybe able to negotiate more. And at the same time, you're trying to keep a domestic political environment in the US during an election year from really hurting the president's chance of winning this very important election for Americans. So it's a very tough balancing act that Biden is facing. And as I said earlier, he has not empowered Blinken really to use all American leverage for the domestic political reasons.
And Roxanne, if hostage talks fail, if these captive talks fail and the ceasefire doesn't happen, then the Biden administration has a real dilemma, doesn't it? Whether to continue to insist on linking the release of the captives with a ceasefire in the face of a clear and present warning from a UN panel of experts that says, look, we're on the brink of a devastating famine that's going to kill tens of thousands.
Yes, it is a dilemma. And I think a new poll in the US actually makes it even more difficult, because it looked like in the poll that a great number of people in the United States, particularly the older ones, are supportive of what Biden is doing. They think that the approach that the Israelis have taken towards the Palestinians is correct. So the numbers are definitely showing in the United States that Biden has to watch what he's doing. But meanwhile, there's this real looming famine, man-made famine. And this is something that is already eroding U.S. reputation in the region and in the world, that it's allowing this to happen. And it's something that clearly this particular trip by Blinken has been put forward to try to avert. And I don't think that it's going to easily lead to sufficient aid reaching Rafah and the rest of the Palestinians in Gaza in time.
And then there's the planned offensive, the Israeli offensive on Rafah, which we'll come to in a second. But Noor, before that, just wondering, what would you say that the majority of Palestinians want here? Clearly a ceasefire, no doubt about that. But what's the bargain that they're prepared to accept? All the hostages, all the captives held in Gaza?
Look, Nick, I don't think that there is a Palestinian who would oppose an agreement whereby all the captives are released in one go. But there is an understanding amongst all Palestinians that the cost for that would be extremely high in terms of what Hamas and the other groups are going to ask. There is, I think, a growing understanding among Palestinians that the expectation or the hope that all Palestinians imprisoned by Israel would be released is not going to happen, especially if we take into account that the number of Palestinians in Israeli prisons has more than doubled since October the 7th. And a lot of the people who were released in the first ceasefire have been detained once more. There's a lot of room for flexibility here, but I think the priority right now, besides, like you said, the ceasefire, is making sure aid enters. The sight of Palestinian children dying of starvation is unbearable, and it will bring things to another breaking point, not just here, but I think in the region as a whole. And then there's the issue of the return of Palestinians displaced to the south of Gaza. This is a very critical point, and this is a point that has been raised time and again in the negotiations in Doha and in Cairo. Palestinians have to be able to return to northern Gaza. Israel is treating this as a leverage point. It doesn't want to talk about it now. It doesn't want to deal with it now. And that is very problematic because the idea, it's all deja vu for Palestinians, that once dispossessed, always dispossessed. Nobody wants to go through that. And Hamas certainly can't afford to pay the political price for not, securing the return of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced from Gaza City and northern Gaza.
Right, and many of them, of course, 1.5 million of them are in Rafah in the south of Gaza. So Roxanne, the Israeli Prime Minister, seems determined to go into Rafah whatever, despite pretty well every nation in the world, including the United States, telling him not to do that because the casualties could be horrifying. But if Netanyahu ignores that and piles in with the potentially dreadful consequences, what could the implications of that be? Not so much on the ground, but politically and diplomatically for Israel and particularly for the United States?
Well, I think we're all in a position where we can't believe it. It's gone on this long, that there have been this many people killed, so many of them women and children, so many of them children, over 40%. And yet nothing has happened, and outrage is being expressed. Of course, it has gone to the International Court of Justice. There have been a number of efforts by human rights organizations, but in effect, there is, of course, in my view, a gradual and increasingly rapid deterioration in reputation and in stature that the United States is encountering broadly, and that I think it has significant effects in terms of diplomacy and our international institutions, that they cannot stop this. But unfortunately, I think it just forces us all to be witnesses to an exceedingly and a terrible situation that's getting consistently and rapidly worse.
And Ambassador, what's your view on that question? And also I wanted to ask you, should the United States decline to supply weapons that would be used in an invasion of Rafah?
Well, I personally would certainly hope so. And I think if we see the Israelis going ahead with a major military operation in Rafah, it'll be really a breaking point with the U.S. I think this is when reality is going to push the administration either to quietly threaten, and maybe they have started already, making it very clear that if Netanyahu proceeds with his plan for a major military operation in Rafah, that there would be very serious consequences. And I would just point to the Schumer comments, Senator Schumer's comments, and President Biden's very obvious support for Senator Schumer's comments. Those are all messages to the Israelis that we're very serious about not moving into Rafah, and that we're willing to go around Netanyahu and appeal to the Israeli public. Now, is that enough leverage? The Israelis have gotten away with a lot over the last 50 years. It's not just the Biden administration. Unfortunately, the American government has a terrible track record when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian issues. We have backslided on so many issues that we're seeing the fruits of them today. And we're getting a huge hit on American credibility, American standing in the world. And the Biden administration happens to be in place to witness all this. For Americans like me and others, it's very difficult because Biden administration has come in after a Republican administration that many of us felt was really on a very bad track record for American standing, both domestically and globally. And so now it's a big issue for Americans domestically. How do you support this president, this administration, and at the same time support what's going on in terms of their policy on Israel and Palestine?
Another big issue is what happens next, Noor. And according to the US Secretary of State, there has been some consensus found between him and Arab foreign ministers on the future. Do you think a ceasefire would open the way to two-state talks? I mean, what's your sense of it? Is he right to sound as bullish as he did about that?
Look, I think the Biden administration's one-eyed perspective on Israel and Palestine is very consistent. Even talking about Palestinian statehood is meant to achieve a big win for Israel. It is not out of a sudden change of heart that actually sees Palestinians as human beings. Otherwise, the US policy wouldn't have allowed and enabled and empowered Israel to go on committing this genocide for the past 6 months, to shield it from accountability at the international stage, and to oppose, what is happening at the International Court of Justice, a court that is now trying Israel for genocide and also considering the whole legal status of this occupation. So I don't really see any change. For the Biden administration, they want to see an Israeli-Saudi deal. Now, the Palestinians happen to be an annoying detail. So they want to kind of push it under the rug, tell the Palestinians we'll work something out. There will be a prospect of something, a prospect of a Palestinian state. That's much of the same. And I would say after everything that has happened, and given the fact that it's still happening, that is nowhere near enough to convince a Palestinian child that American policy is actually serious about their liberation, about their emancipation from this occupation, about telling Israel that it has to make a choice between being a colonizer forever of the Palestinians or to be a country that is accepted as a normal, law-abiding country in the region and beyond. And it's a moment of truth, not just for the Americans, but I think for the whole system, this international system that has allowed this to happen. It has allowed it to persist. And it always treated the Palestinians as the detail that can be sorted out later. It's easy to figure them out. We'll talk about money. We'll talk about support. We'll talk maybe possibly even about some reform. Nothing really serious, because at the end of the day, all of the chips are in the hands of the Israelis. They're given veto power over ending the occupation, over Palestinian sovereignty and independence, over the Palestinian rights in general. That hasn't changed. And so I think all of this is really a waste of time.
Thanks for that, Noor. We're just coming towards the end of the programme, and I just want to fire a couple more questions before we wrap up in a couple of minutes. And Ambassador, first of all, how do you read into Blinken's bullish remarks about the future? Because he knows that Israel won't buy into two states. And you also know well from your ambassadorial experience about, what's said behind the scenes may not be said to the wider public.
I think this whole focus now by the administration on, that the only long-term solution is a two-state solution. There is, I think, I think this whole October 7th attack by Hamas and this debilitating war that we're watching now in Gaza has brought a new realization to many in the United States that this just can't go on. But at the same time, I think anyone who knows the region and knows the Israel-Palestine issue knows that this narrative is, you're talking about a 10, 15 year into the future. You're talking about a two-state solution that has been destroyed in its on the ground by all the things that the Israelis have done in terms of settlements, et cetera, et cetera. So when they talk about a two-state solution right now, I really look at it as more of a PR exercise and as a way to hopefully give some hope to Palestinians that the Americans care enough to even talk about this, which is new. But at the same time, it's not realistic. It's not pragmatic to go down that path when you have such a right-wing government in Israel, and not just the government. You have a right-wing population in Israel now in terms of their support for a Palestinian state.
Okay. Ambassador, I'm going to jump in there. Sorry to interrupt, but I just want to throw a question quickly at Roxanne. We've just time to ask a question about normalization. Before the war, it was on the agenda, but then it disappeared, of course, with everything that's happened. But now it's back on through Saudi, it seems. What do you expect there?
I think that's quite tricky, too. I agree with the ambassador's comments. I think that a lot of this is just hot air in that it's the only thing the U.S. can see at the moment to offer. But I think the Saudis have become closer to the Iranians since this whole Gaza war, to the surprise of many. And I think that would put them into a very tricky position, which I'm not sure they're willing to do at this point. The United States is not seen as credible as it was before. And I think the neighborhood is now becoming much more of a focus for all of the Gulf states. And so I think that's a very tenuous area for Blinken to be looking so cheerful about. And I think one of the things that's also very disconcerting is that in speaking about a two-state solution, I agree with Noor. There is no real discussion with the Palestinians themselves. And if we think about what has happened to them, the level of trauma that they are suffering from, not to mention the fact that their cities have been leveled, I can't picture what their position would be, and they are obviously necessary, critical to any kind of reconstruction thereafter.
All right, and so it goes on. So much more to discuss, but we'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you so much to all our guests, Marcel Huapa, Roxanne Fahmian, and Nora Day. Thank you. And thanks for watching. You can watch the full program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, just go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nick Clark, and the whole team here, it's goodbye for now.